Hi there, welcome to JAYVIL Stories. Please subscribe to my channel and turn on the post notifications to get updated when interesting stories are uploaded. Thank you. Tamuno Briggs stared out of the window of his sleek black SUV as it sped down the winding roads of Omoku. It had been 6 years since he last set foot in his hometown, and though much had changed, the air remained thick with the smell of palm oil processing and faint traces of burning firewood. After completing his studies in London, his father, Chief Briggs, had summoned him back to oversee family businesses in the oil industry. Tamuno, however, felt detached. The wealth and power surrounding his family had always come with expectations he found stifling. The journey to the family's oil site in Erima was unplanned. Tamuno, restless after returning, decided to drive himself instead of relying on his father's convoy. Dressed in a simple white shirt and jeans, he wanted anonymity, a rare commodity as the only son of one of Omoku's most powerful families. The afternoon sun blazed high and sweat trickled down his temple when it happened. His car jolted violently before sputtering to a halt. Tamuno cursed under his breath, stepping out to inspect the problem. A tire had gone flat. Frustrated, he slammed the car door shut and looked around. The road was mostly empty, save for tall palm trees swaying lazily in the distance. Nearby, he spotted a narrow footpath leading toward a cluster of small huts. With no phone signal to call for help, Tamuno decided to follow the path. It led him to a small, bustling community on the outskirts of Ulakwo. Children ran barefoot across the dirt road, and women with baskets of fish on their heads made their way home. The smell of frying plantain filled the air, and for a moment, Tamuno felt like a stranger in his own land. It was there that he met her. By a small roadside stall shaded with palm fronds, Ibiere Opurum stood with her younger brother, carefully arranging pieces of smoked fish. She wore a faded wrapper tied around her waist and a plain white blouse. Her dark skin glowed under the sunlight, her face serene as she hummed softly while working. Tamuno approached hesitantly. "Good afternoon," he said, his voice breaking her rhythm. Ibiere looked up, slightly startled. "Good afternoon," she replied, her voice calm but wary. It wasn't every day that a well-dressed stranger wandered into their community. "Please, I need help," Tamuno said. "My car broke down near the main road. I don't have a signal on my phone." Ibiere paused, sizing him up. He clearly wasn't from around there, but something about his expression, a mix of frustration and helplessness, softened her. "Wait here," she said finally, calling out to her younger brother to watch the stall. Together they walked back toward the stranded SUV. Ibiere's sandals kicked up dust as she led the way, her pace brisk but unhurried. When they reached the car, she bent down to inspect the damage. "You'll need a mechanic," she said simply, wiping her hands on the edge of her wrapper. "I know someone who can help." Before Tamuno could respond, Ibiere flagged down a passing motorcyclist and gave him directions to the nearest mechanic in Ulakwo. Her quiet efficiency left Tamuno both impressed and amused. "Thank you," he said after the motorcyclist sped off. Ibiere shrugged. "It's nothing. Things like this happen." She turned to leave, but Tamuno called out, "Wait, what's your name?" She hesitated before replying, "Ibiere." "And you, Tamuno," he said, smiling faintly. Their eyes met briefly before she turned and walked back down the path. Tamuno watched her leave, struck by something he couldn't quite explain. There was no pretense in her, no effort to impress, only a quiet strength that lingered long after she disappeared into the distance. For the first time in years, Tamuno felt that his life, so neatly planned by others, had taken an unexpected turn. And in that moment, he realized he would see her again. The days after Tamuno Briggs' encounter with Ibiere felt unusually long. For a man used to having everything at his fingertips, his thoughts were now filled with the image of the girl from Ulakwo, her quiet strength, her grace, and the way she had spoken to him without an ounce of pretension. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something special about her. Back at his family's mansion in the heart of Omoku, Tamuno found himself restless. The large compound with its high walls and marble floors suddenly felt empty. He sat through dull meetings with his father's business associates, nodding absently as they discussed oil contracts and future ventures. "What's wrong with you?" Chief Briggs finally asked one evening. "You've been distracted since you got back." "Nothing, sir," Tamuno replied, forcing a smile. But his mind wandered back to Ulakwo, to Ibiere, and to the simple beauty of her world. On the third day, unable to resist the pull any longer, Tamuno made up his mind. He grabbed the keys to his SUV and set out for Ulakwo under the guise of visiting the oil site in Erima. This time he had a purpose. The narrow footpath that had led him to Ibiere's village was more familiar now. He parked his car on the edge of the road and made his way on foot, dust kicking up with every step. The same bustling scene greeted him, women chatting as they washed clothes by the riverside, children playing with sticks in the sand, and the rhythmic pounding of fufu in large wooden mortars. Tamuno's eyes searched the crowd for her. He felt foolish. What would he even say if he saw her? That he came back just to see her again. That thought alone made him smile. Suddenly he saw her. Ibiere was standing by her family's small store arranging bundles of smoked fish. Her hair, neatly plaited, glistened in the sun. She wore a clean blue blouse this time, paired with a faded wrapper tied around her waist. She looked up and spotted him almost immediately. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment Ibiere froze. Her brother, still too young to understand, tugged at her arm and asked who the man was. She ignored him, her gaze fixed on Tamuno as he approached. "You again?" Ibiere asked with a mix of amusement and suspicion when he reached the stall. Tamuno chuckled, trying to appear nonchalant. "I was in the area. I thought I'd stop by." "In Ulakwo? You must be lost again," she teased, her lips twitching into a faint smile. He grinned. "Not this time. I know exactly where I am." Ibiere turned back to her work, pretending to ignore him. "If you're here to buy fish, you're welcome. If not, this stall isn't a resting place." Tamuno laughed, delighted by her wit. "Fine, I'll buy some fish. But you'll have to teach me how to cook it." Her brother snorted with laughter, earning a scolding glare from Ibiere. She shook her head at Tamuno. "You don't seem like someone who can cook anything, let alone fish." Tamuno shrugged playfully. "You never know. I could surprise you." Against her better judgment, Ibiere found herself smiling. Tamuno's charm was disarming, but she knew better than to trust easily. Wealthy men didn't come to places like Ulakwo without a reason, and she wasn't going to let herself become a story for the village gossips. "I'll take the fish," Tamuno said finally, holding up a small bundle she handed him. "But on one condition, you have to tell me more about yourself." Ibiere shot him a look, but there was no malice in her eyes, only caution. "Why would you want to know that?" "Because I'd like to know you," Tamuno said simply, his tone earnest. Ibiere paused, her expression softening before hardening again. She handed him the fish, shaking her head. "That'll be 200 naira." Tamuno paid without protest, and as he turned to leave, he added softly, "I'll be back." Ibiere watched him walk away, unsure whether to feel amused or annoyed. Something about him unsettled her, but for reasons she couldn't explain, she didn't entirely mind. Tamuno's visits to Ulakwo became more frequent, much to Ibiere's confusion and eventual acceptance. At first, she tried to discourage him, brushing off his questions with short replies and refusing to let him linger too long around her family's stall. Yet, no matter how hard she pushed, Tamuno kept coming back. At first, the village buzzed with whispers. Ulakwo was small, and everyone knew when something or someone was out of place. The son of Chief Briggs, a man whose name carried weight in all of Omoku, visiting a simple smoked fish seller regularly, it was enough to ignite tongues. Some said Tamuno was looking for trouble. Others thought he was simply amusing himself. Ibiere paid no attention to the rumors. She had no room in her life for foolishness or heartbreak, having spent years caring for her family after her mother's death. She had watched her father, Papa Opurum, grow frail from age and grief, while her younger brother relied on her for guidance. Ibiere was proud of the woman she had become, strong, independent, and grounded. She had no illusions about wealthy men like Tamuno. But Tamuno was different. He wasn't boastful like others she had met. There was no arrogance in his smile, no hidden intention in his questions. He didn't come with airs or judgment. Instead, he listened. Tamuno wanted to hear about her life, her dreams of becoming a teacher, her struggles to save enough to attend a proper college, and her love for the riverbank. where she often sat to think and escape the weight of her responsibilities. One warm afternoon, Tamuno surprised Ibiere by showing up at her stall carrying two small plastic bowls of jollof rice and chicken. "I figured you wouldn't have time to eat," he said casually, setting the bowls down on a small wooden bench beside her stall. Ibiere frowned. "You shouldn't keep doing this." "Doing what?" he asked, unbothered. "Coming here. People are talking," she muttered, glancing around. "I don't like it." Tamuno sat down beside her. "Let them talk. I came here for you, not them." His words unsettled her. She looked away, pretending to focus on rearranging fish. "You don't know me," she said softly. "Then let me," Tamuno replied, his voice gentle. For a moment, Ibiere was silent. Finally, she sat down next to him. They ate in comfortable quiet, the sounds of the village a distant hum around them. For the first time in years, Ibiere felt seen, not as someone struggling to survive, but as herself. Over time, the riverbank became their special meeting place. On days when Ibiere finished early at the stall, Tamuno would wait for her under the large udara tree by the Orashi River. There, they would talk for hours. Tamuno shared stories about his time abroad, how London streets were always busy and cold, how he sometimes missed home, but didn't always feel like he belonged here either. Ibiere, in turn, spoke of Ulakwo's simplicity, the comfort of the village's rhythm, and how the river seemed to carry away her worries whenever she sat by its edge. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the water, painting the horizon gold and orange, Tamuno turned to Ibiere. "You're different from anyone I've ever met," he said quietly. Ibiere's heart skipped a beat. "You don't know what you're saying." "I do." Tamuno's gaze was steady. "I think about you all the time. I don't want to stop." Ibiere looked away, her hands clutching her wrapper. "You shouldn't say things like that." "Why?" "Because nothing good can come of this," she whispered. Tamuno reached for her hand. "Don't say that. We can make something good happen, Ibiere. You'll see." For the first time, Ibiere let herself believe it could be true. In that golden hour by the river, the seeds of love were sown, gentle, tentative, but undeniable. What neither of them knew was that this love, so fragile and new, was about to face trials neither could imagine. Tamuno sat in the expansive sitting room of his father's mansion in Omoku, staring out of the floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The distant hum of workers at the Briggs oil facilities could be heard faintly. Tamuno's mind, however, was miles away in Ulakwo by the Orashi River, where Ibiere's laughter still echoed in his head. Her presence had become a constant in his life, and nothing brought him more joy than the hours they spent together. But the peace he felt was short-lived. That afternoon, his mother, Madame Beatrice Briggs, summoned him to the family parlor. She sat poised in a regal chair, her wrapper neatly tied, her coral beads gleaming against her skin. Madame Beatrice was not a woman to be trifled with. Her word carried as much weight as her husband's in Omoku's social circles. "Tamuno," she began in her sharp, clipped voice, "we need to talk." Tamuno sighed internally, already sensing what this was about. He had seen the look on her face earlier in the week, one of suspicion and displeasure. "Yes, Mama, what is it?" he asked, trying to sound disinterested. "I've heard troubling news," Madame Beatrice said, her eyes narrowing. "People are talking about you. They say you're spending time with some girl in Ulakwo." "A fish seller, of all things." Tamuno straightened slightly. "Her name is Ibiere, and yes, I've been seeing her." The calmness in his voice seemed to ignite her anger. She leaned forward, her voice rising. "A common girl, Tamuno. Do you have any idea how this makes us look? You're the son of Chief Briggs. Our name commands respect. You cannot associate with people like that." Tamuno met her gaze, unflinching. "Mama, Ibiere is not what you think. She's kind, intelligent, and hardworking. She's nothing like the picture you're painting." Madame Beatrice scoffed. "Kindness and hard work won't change who she is." "Her family is poor, Tamuno. She sells fish. Do you want to drag our name into the mud? What will people say? That you, the heir to the Briggs fortune, are throwing your life away for a girl who lives in a shack?" Tamuno clenched his fists, frustration boiling in his chest. "Mama, I don't care what people say. I care about Ibiere. That is enough." Madame Beatrice snapped, rising from her chair. "You are my son, and I will not let you make a fool of yourself. This infatuation must end immediately. I won't stand for it." Tamuno stood as well, towering over her. I'm sorry, Mama, but I will not stop seeing her. I love her. The room fell silent. Madame Beatrice's expression darkened, her lips pressing into a thin line. She turned her back to him, her voice dangerously low. You think this is love? You're a foolish boy. I will not allow you to disgrace this family. Tamuno took a step back, his voice firm. You can't control my heart, Mama. I won't let you dictate who I love. Madame Beatrice turned sharply, her eyes blazing. If you think you can defy me, Tamuno, you're mistaken. I will not let this girl, this Ibiere, destroy everything we have worked for. Tamuno left the parlor without another word, his heart pounding with anger. He had expected resistance, but not the fire he saw in his mother's eyes. He knew Madame Beatrice would not let this go. That evening, Madame Beatrice summoned one of the family's loyal aides. Find out everything about this girl and her family, she ordered coldly, and bring me news I can use to end this madness. As the aide nodded and left, Madame Beatrice sat back in her chair, her mind already calculating. Meanwhile, Tamuno, sitting alone in his room, looked out at the darkening sky. He knew his mother would not relent, but neither would he. For Ibiere he would fight, even if it meant standing against his own family. Far away in Ulakwo, Ibiere felt a strange unease she couldn't explain, as if a storm was building, one that would change everything. In the days that followed, life in Ulakwo began to change for Ibiere. At first it was subtle, a lingering glance, a whispered word as she passed through the market, but soon the whispers grew louder. She would hear her name in hushed conversations, accompanied by snide remarks. That's the girl Tamuno Briggs keeps visiting. Why would a man like him waste his time on a fish seller? She must be using some charm. Rich men don't just fall in love with poor girls. The words stung like sharp thorns, and though Ibiere pretended not to care, the weight of it grew heavier with each passing day. She would return home from the market with her younger brother, Okubo, pretending everything was fine, but her father, Papa Opurum, noticed the change in her. What is wrong, Ibiere? He asked one evening as they sat under the dim glow of a kerosene lamp. Nothing, Papa, Ibiere replied softly, her voice betraying her weariness. Papa Opurum, though frail, still carried the wisdom of years etched into his face. He had raised Ibiere with pride, teaching her that dignity was the only wealth a poor man could hold on to. Yet the sudden attention on his daughter unsettled him. I hear the rumors, he said gently. This boy, Tamuno Briggs, people are talking. Ibiere looked away, unable to meet her father's gaze. He is not like what they say, Papa. He is kind to me, he makes me feel seen. Papa Opurum sighed deeply, his face clouded with worry. My daughter, kind words do not erase who he is or where he comes from. Men like him do not marry girls like you. It has always been so. Ibiere's heart tightened at her father's words, but she said nothing. Deep down, part of her feared he was right. Meanwhile, in the Briggs mansion, Madame Beatrice's plans to discredit Ibiere were already in motion. The aide she had sent returned with the information she sought. That evening, as Tamuno entered the house, his mother called him into her private sitting room. Tamuno, sit, she said calmly, though the sharpness in her tone was unmistakable. Tamuno remained standing, folding his arms across his chest. If this is about Ibiere again, Mama. It is, Madame Beatrice interrupted, and you need to listen. She rose, holding a small envelope. Do you know what kind of family this girl comes from? Her father is poor, and they live off scraps. Do you think she loves you for who you are? She wants your money, your name. Tamuno shook his head. You don't know her. Madame Beatrice stepped closer, her voice low and cold. You think you are defying me, Tamuno, but you are only disgracing yourself. Ibiere Opurum is not worthy of you. You will ruin everything we have built. Tamuno clenched his fists, anger rising. Mama, stop this. You don't get to decide who I love. His mother's face darkened. You will see the truth soon enough. The next day, Madame Beatrice's rumors spread beyond Ulakwo, trickling into every corner of Omoku. Stories surfaced that Ibiere's family owed money, that she was scheming to trap Tamuno for his wealth. The villagers grew bolder in their words, some even voicing their suspicions to Ibiere directly. Whatever you're doing to that boy, stop it, an elderly woman hissed at her in the market. That evening, Papa Opurum sat quietly on the veranda, staring at nothing. When Ibiere returned, he didn't greet her. Instead, he finally spoke, his voice heavy with defeat. Ibiere, this thing between you and that boy must end. Ibiere's heart dropped. Papa, please don't say that. I have no choice, Papa Opurum's voice cracked. They are saying things about us. People look at me like a beggar, like I have sold you off for their money. I cannot bear it. Tears welled in Ibiere's eyes as she realized the full weight of what was happening. The love that had brought her joy was now tearing her world apart. That night, Ibiere sat alone by the Orashi River, her tears falling into its still waters. She knew Madame Beatrice's influence was vast and her family's name carried no shield. For Tamuno she would fight, but as the rumors grew and her father's burden deepened, Ibiere began to wonder, was love enough to withstand a storm this fierce? Ibiere sat on the edge of her wooden bed that night, staring blankly at the flickering flame of the kerosene lamp. Her father's words echoed endlessly in her mind, like waves crashing against the rocks. This thing between you and that boy must end. She had tried so hard to shield her family from the storm that Tamuno's love had stirred, but the whispers and ridicule were growing louder every day. Tamuno's visits had not slowed. He came to Ulakwo every other day, smiling, joking, and speaking to her as if nothing else in the world mattered. But everything mattered now, the shame her family faced, the stares, the false rumors spreading like wildfire. The following afternoon, as she stood by the river washing clothes, Papa Opurum approached her. His steps were slow, weighed down not just by age but by a burden too heavy to carry. He sat beside her silently, watching the water ripple under the weight of her hands. Ibiere, he said softly. She paused, turning toward him. Yes, Papa, I have spoken to Madame Beatrice, he confessed. His voice was barely above a whisper, as though he feared the words. Ibiere froze. You did what? Papa Opurum's face was filled with shame, his gaze fixed on the flowing water. She came here, she offered, money. Enough to settle my debts, to help Dokubo finish school. He looked up, his eyes wet with unshed tears. I refused at first, but what choice do I have? I cannot allow you to suffer for this. Her chest tightened, her voice trembling. Papa, you cannot sell my happiness. I love him. This is not about love, Ibiere, he said firmly. It's about survival. I cannot fight people like them. They are too powerful, too connected. Do you think Madame Beatrice will stop? She will ruin us completely. Ibiere clenched her fists, her knuckles white. For all her father's love, she knew he was right. Madame Beatrice would never relent until she tore them apart. That evening, Tamuno arrived at the riverbank, just as he always did. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and gold, but to Ibiere, the world felt dim. She sat on a rock, staring at the water as Tamuno approached, his usual smile lighting up his face. You look troubled, he said gently, sitting beside her. What's wrong? Ibiere didn't look at him. Instead, she forced her voice to be cold, hard, like stone. Tamuno, we can't keep doing this. He frowned, taken aback. What do you mean? I mean it's over, she said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts. We can't see each other again. Tamuno reached for her hand, but she pulled away, still refusing to meet his gaze. Ibiere, what's going on? Did something happen? Nothing happened, she lied. I just don't love you anymore. The silence that followed was deafening. Tamuno stared at her in disbelief, his heart pounding. You're lying. I'm not, she said, rising to her feet. This was never real for me, Tamuno. Go back to your world and leave me to mine. He stood up too, his voice rising with desperation. Ibiere, look at me. Tell me you don't love me while looking into my eyes and I'll leave. I'll never come back. She turned away, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. I don't love you, she whispered, her voice trembling. Tamuno's heart shattered at her words. He stood frozen, staring at her back as she walked away, disappearing down the narrow path that led to her village. For the first time, Tamuno felt completely helpless. The love that had brought him so much joy had just slipped through his fingers, leaving behind an emptiness he couldn't describe. That night, as Ibiere lay in her small room, she wept silently, clutching her pillow as if it could absorb the pain. Her sacrifice felt like a knife to her heart, but she did it for her father, for her brother, and for the peace of her family. In the distance, the Orashi River continued to flow, carrying away her silent cries, her dreams, and the love she had buried deep inside. The days turned into weeks and the weeks into months. For Tamuno Briggs, time seemed to stretch endlessly. The vibrant light that once filled his days had dimmed, replaced by a hollow emptiness he couldn't shake. When he left Omoku for Port Harcourt shortly after Ibiere's rejection, he threw himself into work. His father, Chief Briggs, delighted in Tamuno's sudden focus, assuming it was a sign of maturity. But Tamuno knew the truth. He wasn't working because he wanted to build the family empire. He was working to forget. At night when the world was quiet, he would sit alone in his hotel room, staring at nothing in particular. Memories of Ibiere haunted him. The way she smiled shyly when he teased her, the sound of her voice as she shared her dreams, the way the evening light had always seemed to glow around her by the Orashi River. He replayed their final conversation over and over in his head, convinced there was more to her words than she had let on. "I don't love you anymore." He refused to believe it. Meanwhile, life in Ulakwo moved on, but not for Ibiere. The 2 years that followed were a test of strength and endurance. She had sacrificed her happiness for her family, but the cost weighed heavily on her. Ibiere spent her days teaching at the small community school, helping children from the village learn to read and write. It was a simple job, one that paid little, but it was enough to put food on the table. Every morning, she would rise before dawn, wash clothes, and prepare her younger brother, Dokubo, for school. She buried herself in routines, trying to keep busy, as though hard work could erase Tamuno from her thoughts. But he was always there, lurking in her mind like a shadow. Every time she walked past the Orashi River, she felt her heart ache, remembering their shared moments of laughter and hope. Sometimes when no one was looking, Ibiere would sit by the water's edge, her knees pulled to her chest, tears streaming down her face. She had convinced herself that she had done the right thing. Her father's debts were cleared and Dokubo had returned to school, his future secured. But her own dreams and her heart were shattered. Back in Port Harcourt, Tamuno's transformation had not gone unnoticed. The once lively and charming man had become distant and unapproachable. Even the people who worked closely with him treaded carefully. His mother, Madame Beatrice Briggs, watched him closely but said nothing, secretly pleased that Ibiere was out of the picture. One evening, as Tamuno sat on the balcony of his hotel suite overlooking the city skyline, his childhood friend, Tari, paid him a visit. Tari began, leaning against the railing. "You've changed." "This isn't the Tamuno I know." "I'm fine," Tamuno said flatly. "No, you're not," Tari insisted. "Is this about that girl from Ulakwo?" "What happened?" Tamuno turned to look at him, his jaw tight. "She didn't love me, Tari. I wasn't enough for her." Tari shook his head. "I don't believe that. You don't either. Whatever happened back there, there's more to it." Tamuno remained silent, but Tari's words planted a seed of doubt. Could there have been something Ibiere wasn't telling him? Had he walked away too soon, back in Ulakwo, Ibiere's life carried on in quiet monotony. She smiled less and spoke little, but she endured. To the people of Ulakwo, she was strong, hardworking, and dependable. But beneath the surface, her heart still bore the weight of the love she had given up. Every now and then, she would look up at the distant horizon, wondering if Tamuno ever thought of her, if he was happy, if he had moved on. It was a thought she carried like a scar, one that would never truly heal. 2 years of silence had passed, but the river continued to flow, as though it alone knew the truth that time had not erased. 2 years had passed since Tamuno Briggs last set foot in Ulakwo, and yet the familiar feeling of home stirred in his chest as his car bumped over the uneven roads leading to the outskirts of Omoku. This time, he wasn't here for leisure or rebellion against his family's expectations. He had returned as part of his family's oil company's latest community initiative, the construction and launch of a new health center. His father, Chief Briggs, had tasked him with overseeing its final phases. But Tamuno knew this was more than work for him. Coming back to Omoku meant facing the past he had tried so hard to bury, the river, the village, and most of all, Ibiere. He stepped out of the car as they arrived at the health center site, where preparations for the launch ceremony were already underway. Women in colorful wrappers carried baskets of food and drinks, while local drummers set up nearby. The scent of roasted yam and fried fish wafted through the air, reminding him of simpler days. As he walked around inspecting the final touches, Tamuno's gaze wandered to the crowd. Villagers had gathered in clusters, chatting excitedly about the project. A few faces looked familiar, but one stood out above all. At the far end of the site, beneath the shade of a large udara tree, Tamuno saw her, Ibiere. She was surrounded by a group of children, her soft voice instructing them on where to sit. Her hair was neatly plaited and she wore a simple yellow dress that seemed to glow in the afternoon sun. Though 2 years had passed, she looked almost unchanged, except for the weight in her eyes that spoke of silent struggles. For a moment, Tamuno froze. His heart pounded loudly in his chest as if it had recognized a piece of itself it had been missing. He had imagined this moment countless times, but seeing her now left him speechless. Ibiere, he whispered under his breath. As if sensing his presence, Ibiere looked up. Her eyes widened and the smile she'd been giving the children faltered. Time seemed to stand still as their gazes locked. Neither moved, neither spoke. Tamuno began walking toward her, his steps slow but determined. The children around her scattered, leaving them alone beneath the tree. Ibiere shifted nervously, clutching the edge of her dress. "You look well," Tamuno said finally, his voice low but steady. Ibiere swallowed hard, trying to steady her racing heart. "Thank you, you're back." "For work," he replied, searching her face. "But it's not just that." She looked away, pretending to focus on the crowd. "I didn't expect to see you again. And yet here we are," Tamuno said softly. 2 years, Ibiere. 2 years, and you're still the only thing I think about." "Tamuno, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, Ibiere," he interrupted, his tone now firmer. "Not this time, I need answers. That day by the river, the things you said, you were lying, weren't you?" Ibiere blinked rapidly, tears gathering in her eyes. "Tamuno, it's in the past." "It's not in the past for me," he shot back, his voice rising. "You told me you didn't love me, but I never believed it. Not for 1 second. Tell me the truth, Ibiere. Tell me why you pushed me away." Ibiere turned her face, wiping her tears quickly. "I had no choice," she said quietly. "You wouldn't understand." "Then make me understand." Her silence was deafening. For a moment, the sound of the drummers and the chatter of the crowd seemed like a distant hum, drowned out by the weight of their emotions. "Please," Tamuno whispered, stepping closer. "Don't I deserve the truth?" Ibiere looked up at him, her tears finally falling freely. "Yes, Tamuno," she whispered, "you do. But not here, not now." Tamuno's gaze softened. He nodded, understanding that the time would come, and when it did, the truth would change everything. For now, though, they stood together under the udara tree, bound by a love that time had not erased and a truth waiting to be revealed. The evening sun was dipping behind the trees as Tamuno and Ibiere walked quietly along the familiar path toward the Orashi River. The distant sounds of drums and laughter from the health center's launch faded with each step, leaving only the whisper of the wind and the rhythmic flow of the river ahead. Tamuno's heart pounded in his chest. He had waited 2 long years for answers, and he was determined to hear the truth. Ibiere walked a few paces ahead, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as though shielding herself from a storm she knew was coming. She hadn't wanted to come here with Tamuno, but there was no running anymore. The pain she had carried was too heavy, and it was time for him to know. When they reached the river bank, she stopped, her back still to him. The Orashi River stretched out before them, its waters calm and golden under the dying light. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional chirping of birds returning to their nests. "Ibiere," Tamuno said softly, breaking the quiet. "I've waited long enough. Please, no more hiding." Ibiere closed her eyes and let out a shaky breath. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Tamuno, what do you want from me?" "The truth," he said firmly. 2 years ago, you pushed me away. You told me you didn't love me, but I knew it was a lie. I saw it in your eyes. What happened? What made you walk away from us?" Ibiere looked down at the ground, her hands trembling. "Your mother, Madame Beatrice. She came to see my father." Tamuno's brows furrowed. "What, my mother?" "She offered him money," Ibiere continued, her voice breaking. "Enough to settle his debts and send Dokubo to school. We were drowning, Tamuno. Papa couldn't say no, and neither could I." Tamuno's eyes widened, his fists clenching at his sides. She paid you to leave me? No, Ibiere said softly, shaking her head. She didn't need to. I did it for my family. I did it because I had no choice. She told me I wasn't good enough for you. She told me she would destroy everything I loved if I didn't walk away. I couldn't let that happen. I had to protect my father and my brother. I had to let you go. The weight of her words hit Tamuno like a blow to the chest. He staggered back a step, his jaw tight, his heart pounding furiously. Why didn't you tell me? What would it have changed? Ibiere asked, tears now streaming down her cheeks. Your mother would never have stopped, Tamuno. She's powerful and I'm nothing. I thought walking away would end it. I thought it would be better for you. Tamuno's voice trembled with anger. Better for me? You let me believe you didn't love me. You let me think I wasn't enough. I'm sorry, Ibiere whispered, her face crumpling. I thought I was doing the right thing. Tamuno stared at her, his heart aching as he watched the woman he loved break down before him. The truth was both a relief and a dagger to his chest. He stepped forward, reaching for her hands, forcing her to look up at him. You didn't have to bear this alone, he said gently, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. You should have trusted me. You are nothing, Ibiere. You are everything, Ibiere sobbed, her walls finally crumbling. Tamuno pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as if to shield her from all the pain she had carried. I won't let anyone take you from me again, he murmured into her hair. Not my mother, not anyone. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, the Orashi River bore silent witness to the truth that had finally been spoken and the love that had survived despite the odds. Far away in the Briggs mansion, Madame Beatrice sat in her parlor, unaware that the battle she thought she had won was far from over. The next morning, the sun rose gently over Omoku, but for Tamuno Briggs, it felt like the dawn of a new chapter. The anger he felt toward his mother burned within him, but alongside it was a renewed determination to fight for the woman he loved. After 2 years of separation and pain, he wouldn't let anyone stand in their way, not even Madame Beatrice. Tamuno drove back to his family's mansion in silence, his jaw set, his mind replaying Ibiere's words from the night before. She told me she would destroy everything I loved. His mother had underestimated Ibiere's strength and his love for her. It was time to set things right. When he entered the sprawling sitting room, Madame Beatrice was there, as always, perched like royalty on a velvet chair. She looked up from her tea, surprised at the stormy expression on her son's face. Tamuno, she began, placing her cup down. Why do you look so troubled? I thought yesterday's ceremony went well. Tamuno stepped forward, his voice firm. Mama, I know what you did to Ibiere. Her face twitched slightly, but she quickly recovered. I don't know what you're talking about. Yes, you do, Tamuno snapped, his voice rising. You offered her father money. You threatened her family. You manipulated her into leaving me, and you made me believe she didn't love me. Madame Beatrice's calm mask faltered, her lips pressing into a thin line. Tamuno, I did what was necessary. That girl had no place in our lives. Do you think I would allow you to throw away your future for someone I love? Tamuno interrupted sharply. Someone who's more honest, kind, and strong than anyone I know. Is that what you call throwing away my future? Madame Beatrice rose to her feet, her voice cold. You are my son, Tamuno. I know what's best for you. Tamuno's gaze hardened. No, Mama. You know what's best for your pride. You never cared about me or what I wanted. Ibiere is the woman I love, and nothing you do can change that. His father, Chief Briggs, entered the room just as the conversation reached its peak. What's going on here? He asked, his deep voice commanding attention. Tamuno turned to him. Papa, ask Mama what she did to Ibiere and her family. Ask her how far she went to tear us apart. Chief Briggs looked at his wife questioningly. Beatrice, what is this about? Madame Beatrice remained silent, her pride refusing to admit the truth. Chief Briggs, shaking his head in disappointment, looked at Tamuno. If you love this girl and she loves you, then no one should stand in your way. Tamuno turned back to his mother. This ends today. Whether you accept it or not, I will marry Ibiere and I will make her my wife. For the first time, Madame Beatrice looked truly defeated. She sank back into her chair, unable to argue further. The realization that she had lost her son's trust hit her hard. and for a fleeting moment her expression softened. "If this is what you truly want," she whispered. "It is," Tamuno said firmly. "And it always has been." A week later, the Orashi River sparkled under the bright sun as villagers from Ulakwo and guests from Omoku gathered for Tamuno and Ibiere's wedding. The air was alive with music, laughter, and the sound of women ululating in celebration. Children ran around joyfully, while elders sat in shaded spots, nodding their approval at the union. Ibiere stood at the riverbank in a simple but beautiful white gown, her hair adorned with small wildflowers. She looked radiant, her smile bright and burdened for the first time in years. Tamuno approached her, dressed in a traditional white tunic with gold embroidery. As he took her hand, he whispered softly, "We made it." Ibiere's eyes shone with tears of happiness. "Yes, we did." Under the clear sky and before their families and friends, Tamuno and Ibiere exchanged vows, their love now stronger than ever. Even Madame Beatrice, though reluctant, was present, watching quietly from the crowd. Chief Briggs sat proudly in the front row, a small smile on his face. As the ceremony ended and the drums resumed their beat, Tamuno turned to Ibiere, his voice filled with promise. "No one will ever come between us again." Ibiere smiled, her heart finally free of the burden she had carried. "I believe you." Together, they walked hand in hand toward their future, while the Orashi River flowed beside them, a silent witness to the trials they had faced and the love that had triumphed. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.